All right, so you have defeated the dragon after years of questing after this, and you have gathered up all of its loot, and you're walking into the city, and they're literally throwing you a parade because this is such an incredible feat that you have just accomplished. What do you want to do?
It's wonderful. Obviously, I am ecstatic and more than intensely excited. I say to the crowds, I say thank you, and you're welcome. And I try to get across exactly how ecstatic I am that they're throwing us this parade in our honor. And I'm going to speak to my patron, the little magic green frog on my shoulder.
Which again, none of you in the party have ever seen.
And I'm going to say, well, you helped me. And the world is safe. And I'm so moved by this. Nearly crying. Definitely completely emotional.
Okay. Well, it turns out that your warlock might be schizotypal. Schizotypal, not a word that we use very often.
Most people say schizophrenia, and that's a completely different thing, I found out.
Yes, quite different.
All right, so schizotypal.
This continues our series on D&D Diagnosis, where we talk about some of the ways that you could build a D&D character using the Player's Handbook and the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Manual for Mental Health Disorders. Once again, Peter and I are not licensed counselors. We are just having fun with these two ideas. This should not be used beyond the scope of just creating a really fun character and thinking about things.
And it's giving Trevor an easy way to study while getting excited for it. So.
Yeah, it's way easier to study when I put this in a fantasy realm rather than thinking about how this is a real disorder that real people struggle with. And
so don't judge your players or your adventuring party or your DM, because we're not licensed. Schizotypal.
Okay, so I'm going to read through some of the criteria for this concept. First, let's talk about the warlock.
Okay, so the warlock is, I'll read exactly what it says. Defined by a pact with an otherworldly being. Sometimes the relationship between the warlock and patron is like that of a cleric and a deity, though the being that serves as the patrons for warlocks are not gods. The warlock learns and grows in power. Stories of warlocks binding themselves to fiends are widely known. Sometimes, while poring over tomes, forbidden lore, and such, a brilliant but crazed student's mind is open to the realities beyond the material world. And this is kind of the how intense it is. And it says, spend some time thinking about your patron. And now, of course, in our world, we don't have patrons.
However, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I was gonna, because I knew you had something.
Yep. The first thing that we need to talk about in this is the context within which we're making this diagnosis. So obviously, if a warlock came to our world, there would be all sorts of problems. Not even mentally, but just like, how does this power work? How does this science and magic work and associate? Okay, so we got those issues, right? Now, there are other things where the DSM is thinking about the world in a specific way, and generally there's some issues with the DSM where it may not be culturally diverse or taking in different things. And so like, if you have a strong spirituality, you may have a few of these symptoms, but they aren't problematic and they aren't bad or negative. They just are the way that you view the world because of your spirituality. We're going to kind of assume that for the warlock, we know that there is truth in their magic system and truth in their patrons.
And there is a whole pantheon of gods. So it's not set in this world. It is set in D&D.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so we'll keep that in mind as we go forward, because the first diagnostic symptom for schizotypal personality disorder is ideas of reference, but not delusional reference. Now, this is something that I had to go and talk to some of my colleagues about. The idea of reference is sort of similar to if you've ever walked into a restaurant and you thought, everyone is looking at me. Or if you knew that you had done something, you were kind of ashamed about it, and you walk into a room and you're like, oh, everybody knows. That's the concept of reference, where you have somehow become the center of either attention or the way that things are going.
Right.
Delusional reference is what we're going to call real reference in D&D of my life course will change the course of history. My existence is preventing the apocalypse, or
almost a pride that in this world would be considered, to use a legal term, insane. But in D&D, you don't play a character that isn't a world shaper, because the whole point is that you are shaping the course of history.
Yeah. So if your patron is the fiend, and part of your pact that you knew the fiend was going to emerge and destroy the world, but as long as you could hold on to this being the acolyte of the great fiend, which keeps them hidden. And so in a lot of ways, that may be some reference of you think that you're more important than you actually are, or delusional reference, whatever. I'm going to go with it.
Yeah.
I'm going to say a warlock fits this nicely. Odd beliefs or magical thinking that influences behavior and is inconsistent with subculture norms.
So this is seen a lot in, minor spoilers, in Critical Role Season 2 with Laura Bailey's Jester, because all of the other players don't believe that she actually has a patron, because they just don't believe her, even though we as viewers see the traveler in every, in normal experiences. And so to them, she is that way in our world.
Yeah.
Back to it.
So if you're creating a warlock to fit this diagnosis, you could have them be overly superstitious, believe in clairvoyance, telepathy, sixth sense, and maybe have bizarre fantasies or preoccupations. Some of these may not be a huge stretch because you can do some of those things magically.
And one thing I think that would be really interesting would be to have a character who is playing as a warlock and has schizotypal, but is actually, only magical because of an amulet, and doesn't have a patron, or is only magical because of their background.
So they literally are crazy.
And they have a patron, and this patron exists to them, and the other players buy it. And they're like, oh, of course you have a patron. People have patrons. Magic is real. It's here. It's right now. And it's completely false.
Would be so cool. And it fits kind of nicely because the warlock doesn't get very many spell slots. They can do some magical things. They have, of course, Eldritch Blast, the most broken cantrip in the game. But to play a character who maybe it's all made up in their head, and there's something else that's happening that's actually giving them the magic, could be really interesting, because then you could have an encounter with the patron and the party, but the party doesn't see anything, but the warlock is being greatly affected by the patron and all of this. It's super cool.
And DMs, I want you to make a big bad evil guy that has this. And the big bad evil guy thinks they're doing everything to unleash demons on the world and is purposefully doing all this stuff. And they're just nuts. They're flat out crazy. There's not actually a god. They're schizotypal.
And this fits in nicely with the next symptom, which is unusual perception experiences, including bodily illusions. And so you could have the warlock fall over on their back because they were pushed by a person who does not exist.
Ooh, or I raise my hand and green energy forms in my palm and shoots out. And they're like, man, it's actually like Guiding Bolt.
Yeah.
But you think it's Eldritch Blast. Because you're seeing what's not there.
Or if you thought that, we could mix this up with maybe some body dysmorphia as well. where
yeah.
you have some interesting thoughts about how you view yourself and how the world views you, and put that into your reference idea where if I walk into a room, nobody's actually looking at me. They're looking at the horns that have grown out of the back of my head.
Right there. Or they're looking at my missing left arm, but you actually have a left arm. Would be awesome. Love to see, like an archer who thinks he doesn't have an arm and is like magically pulling the string back, but he actually has his right arm.
He's got a tattoo that there just is the spell Mage Hand written out on it,
Right.
and believes that that's what's allowing
It's
it to
just
move.
a mage hand. Oh,
Oh man, so good, so good.
All
Okay, so here's a few things that also could be used for roleplay. Odd thinking in speech, vague, circumstantial, metaphorical, over elaborate, or stereotyped language.
which is fun in D&D.
Oh,
Everyone
yeah.
loves that.
Just make your warlock weird. Suspiciousness or paranoid ideation.
I mean, I think paranoid warlocks are almost a given.
I think that fits super well with the class just in general.
Yeah, in general. I mean, if you have a god that only talks to you and no one else can see you, like it's kind of like, yeah.
And if you want to take it to the next step, use the next symptom, which is inappropriately constricted affect. Have you ever seen Captain Holt from 9-9?
Yeah.
He has constricted affect.
I'm so excited. My husband is taking me to Cancun.
I'm
I've never
elated.
been this happy before.
Constricted affect.
Yeah.
Play your character like that. It'll be so cool. Have them. I am absolutely horrified in this moment, and I have just urinated all over myself out of fear.
I love it.
So good.
Someone has to have made the Brooklyn Nine-Nine into like 5e characters by now.
So good.
Dungeon Master Dave probably has done it. Great.
Behavior or appearance that is odd, eccentric, or peculiar. So let's go with the idea of the referential body dysmorphic horns.
Okay.
So maybe your warlock wears elaborate head dresses to distract people from the horns
Or
that
to
aren't actually there.
To hide them entirely, and then the party's like, oh, he has horns, and so like, and then one day his headdress comes off or falls off, and they're like, oh, he doesn't have horns.
He has some like little like
He
bumps.
just has cowlicks.
Yeah.
He has like his hair is just sticking up a bit.
Lack of close friends and confidence other than first degree relatives. I think that this is probably a little bit of a rule out, but we have enough diagnostic criteria. I think that your adventuring party would kind of fit.
Well, and like Caleb Widowgast, again, Critical Role Season 2, he very much keeps all of the other players at arm's length. That, you know, he does not consider them friends. He wants to cut and run basically the whole, I don't know, first 30 episodes.
Yep.
He wants to cut and run. So
And along with that, the next symptom is excessive social anxiety that does not diminish with familiarity and tends to be associated with paranoid fears rather than negative judgments about self. So you may have a very confident warlock who has a lot of social anxiety that just never goes away. And how do you play that out with our concept that we talked about in our barbarian episode? How do you do that in a way that still shows some character growth?
And I would love to see, like, because that social anxiety is almost growing as they're pretending to be more and more sure of themselves, you could give yourself like 1d4 negative to rolls because of how it's affecting your character.
Yeah. One other cool thing before we go on to your pages
you're good.
is they may feel that they have special powers to sense events before they happen or to read thoughts of others. They may believe that they have magical control over others, which can be implemented directly or indirectly through compliance with magical rituals. What if your warlock thinks they have a whole lot more spell slots than they actually do and starts doing things that aren't magical at all? They're just part of their concept that they have more magical power than is really happening.
And here's the twist. You should roll a d20 every time you do that. And if you roll a natural 20, the spell happens anyway.
Or coincidentally, something happens
Right.
that fits within that schema.
Murphy's Law or whatever that
So good. Okay, so real quick, we have to have 5 or more of the following present in a variety of contexts. So I think that we have ideas of reference. We have odd beliefs. We have unusual perceptions. We can add odd thinking and speech. We can add suspicious and paranoia. We can add inappropriate constricted effect. We could add behavior or appearance that's odd or eccentric. We wouldn't count the lack of close friends. We could use the excessive social anxiety. So that's a total of 8 that we could fit. Naturally, as a warlock, I think that at least the first 3 do fit perfectly. And so it's easy to say that this diagnosis would fit.
So this definitely fits a warlock. It definitely fits Liam O'Brien's Caleb Widowgas in the first few episodes, at least, of Critical Role Season 2.
Whether that was intentional or not, good job, Liam. That's awesome. And you can see how much fun it is to be able to use some of this to kind of build your character.
Yeah, exactly. I would love to see like that weird speech turned into like using words that you think you know the meaning of, but you don't actually, and you don't believe anybody when they correct you.
Yeah.
Like, man, I feel so distracted today. And they're like looking at themselves in the mirror. They're like, oh gosh, this haircut is just so distracted. Just that kind of thing I think could be hilarious. So one thing is schizotypal personality disorder may be first apparent in childhood and adolescence with being solitary, which is, alone, lonesome. How many D&D characters are the lone wanderer,
right?
That decides to join a group for some reason or another? Poor peer relationships, social anxiety, underachievement in school, all of these things could definitely easily fit into most characters' backstories. One thing I really liked is these cognitive and perceptual distortions must be evaluated in the context of the individual's cultural milieu, which is what we talked about at the beginning. It doesn't make sense for basically all warlocks would have this, except their patrons are real. And so we have to kind of change how we're looking at it. But even so, again, we still think they fit it. And then...
and one other thing, I don't know if you're about to talk about this.
Well, I was going to talk about how a warlock who multi-classes into a necromancer, because often their religious beliefs go into things like voodoo, speaking in tongues, shamanism, life beyond death, mind reading, sixth sense, the evil eye, magic beliefs. So all of these things could happen in an extensive way to the warlock, where it becomes more and more real, and then they multi-class into actually having the magical ability because their belief was so strong.
Yeah, I like that. Another thing that I think is really interesting, I think it's talking about in some of the development that there is a genetic components to it. Schizotypal personality disorder appears to have an aggregated familial aspect and is more prevalent among first-degree biological relatives of individuals with schizophrenia than among the general population. And so you could play into, my mother was a schizophrenic, or my father had, this was a part of my family of origin, and
King George of England.
And have some evidence of why now this individual has schizotypal personality disorder.
And so it's writing you your character's backstory for you. It's basically giving you everything you need to create a really interesting, unique, yet still easy to play because it's pretty normal character.
Yeah. And once again, we've said it like 3 times now.
We're going to keep saying it.
But we are saying this with the utmost respect of people and individuals, knowing that the DSM is filled with diagnoses that are real for a lot of people, and we don't want to make light of anyone's struggles. We are just looking for ways to engage our minds in thinking about the DSM and the player's handbook and how these mix, and talking about how personality disorders like schizotypal, they have traits that all of us have. It's just to more of an extreme.
And if you know someone that has this, what a way to get into their mind, maybe, to force yourself to play this. Now, I wouldn't ever dream of equating a D&D session with someone's real life experiences. But if you can garner some measure of understanding from doing this, it might help you kind of give a context to their behavior.
Yeah. And I really like what you said of building some empathy.
Yeah.
Of, wow, it's really hard to make my character function in this world and in this game. I'm having a lot of trouble. And then being able to say, like, I can only imagine how much harder it would be to interact with this world if I was struggling in this way. I think it can be a really beautiful way to build some empathy. And as we're going through this, to think about, a lot of the things that we do in D&D and in fantasy are just reflections of real life. And we may be escaping, but ultimately we're using real world experiences to escape into this. And so what does it say about us as we're going through this? And what does it say about the world? And how can we use this to grow and develop as real people?
Yeah. D&D is just normal life to the extreme with magic.
The way real life should be.
We'll catch you next time.